Hello and welcome to the Tennessee Informer. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Before we get started tonight, I want to give a very big thank you to Jonathan and Mary League of Clarksville, Tennessee. They made a very generous donation to the Tennessee Informer to help support our show. We really do appreciate it. If you would like to make a donation yourself, please contact us at tninformer.tv@gmail.com. Once again, we really appreciate it. We are working on getting a donation button added to our website and will appreciate any support we receive. This Friday is the 4th of July, our country's 249th birthday. My question is, do we really understand the principles that our founders fought for? Was it primarily about taxation? What actually led to the revolution, and what was the nature of that revolution? How much of the freedom and liberty won in the revolution/war of independence have we allowed to be stolen again by an overreaching federal government? We'll discuss this with our special guest, author Joe Wolverton, JD, of the John Birch Society. But first, a Trump update. Trump's butt ugly bill, big beautiful bill as he likes to call it, is being debated in the Senate, and hopefully some of the fat will be trimmed on that bill. I'm hoping that they improve it, and I'm hoping that the House will concur. But there is a lot of bad things in that bill. You've got the whole AI deal, a provision that would prevent the states from having any say-so over AI for 10 years. I know there's a compromise out there that Cruz and Blackburn have come up with, a compromise amendment. We'll see how that goes. Another thing that's disturbing about the bill is there were some tax provisions in there impacting the Second Amendment. There was going to be a tax removed on suppressors and a tax that was going to be removed on short-barreled weapons, and that was in the House bill. Well, that's been stripped out. It was stripped out by the Senate parliamentarian, and our Republican majority didn't bother to fight to put that back in. But we'll see how it goes. He hopes to have it done by the 4th. I think that's optimistic. I just hope we end up with a bill that is not going to put us in a bigger hole. War Powers resolution failed. It was sponsored by Tim Kaine, actually supported by Rand Paul. I think he was probably the only Republican that supported it. And of course, we know that Tim Kaine, I don't think had any issue during the Obama years or the Biden years with the president doing what he wanted, no matter what that was, no matter whether it was constitutionally authorized. Having said that, I think there is a problem with I think there's a problem with this idea that a president, any president, has carte blanche, and that as long as he doesn't declare war, he can do pretty much what he wants. He can commit acts of war as long as he doesn't declare it. I got a real problem with that. I understand Democrats are playing politics. It's just like Calhoun said, the party out of power will act like they care about the Constitution when they're not in power. Once they're in power, they don't care about the Constitution. And the other party will then act like they care about the Constitution. He was right then, he's right now. We'll talk more about war resolution later. Supreme Court, it was interesting this last week. They did they ended the nationwide injunctions by district judges. And in that decision, Amy Coney Barrett kind of made a direct jab at, what is her name? What's a woman Jackson? Ketanji, what's a woman Jackson? Because she doesn't know what a woman is, but she's a Supreme Court justice. And pointed out that she's opposed to executive supremacy, but she's okay with judicial supremacy. And that was a good point, a point well taken. I think the overall problem is our country has accepted federal supremacy, whether it comes from the court or whether it comes from the executive, in way too many cases where it was never intended, of course, according to the Constitution. So, now to our guest, Joe Wolverton. Joe Wolverton, II, JD, is the John Birch Society's constitutional law scholar and head of a dedicated think tank focused on promoting and preserving the U.S. Constitution. With his profound passion for constitutional law, Wolverton brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to this role. As a distinguished attorney and scholar, he has consistently demonstrated a commitment to defending and upholding the principles enshrined in the Constitution, as well as restoring the knowledge of the authors whose works influenced thinking and writing of the Founding Fathers. He is the author of 4 books: The Real James Madison, What Degree of Madness? Great book, by the way. Madison's Method to Make America States Again. The Article 5 the Article 5 Guide for Citizens and Citizens Legislators and the Founders Recipe, an introduction to the writings of the 37 authors most often quoted by the founding generation. He also hosts the popular YouTube channel, Teacher of Liberty, and the TikTok channel, Joe Wolverton JD. Joe, thank you again for joining us. How's everything going?
It's going so well, Dave. I appreciate you having me on. And I've actually had 2 books come out since you had your thing there. I've had a new biography of James Madison and something you're particularly, so the new biography of James Madison, that's one thing, but something that your audience particularly will enjoy is my book that just came out, I guess a week ago, is this by Compact, Not Command. A pretty cover there, as you can see. This is a collection of founding era documents on federalism.
Oh, wow.
These are documents that nobody knows exist anymore, nobody reads anymore, but were foundational essays and documents regarding how the Constitution was supposed to function with regard to the states and the state sovereignty and the state's relation. In this book, I just finally decided, you know what? People aren't going to look these things up, so I'm gonna just put them together. And so we have this book by Compact, Not Command, and even in the title, it's letting you know that union was formed voluntarily, as Madison says in Federalist 39. That each state, as an independent sovereign republic, joined the union voluntarily by compact, that is to say contract, not by command. And I'm going to tell you, Dave, these things, each one of these could be a class, a lesson unto itself, because even the names, you look through here and you get something like John Taylor of Caroline, a name that, 120 years ago, every school kid could tell you who John Taylor. Abel Upshur, I mean, not only a great writer and great judge, but a hero, a military hero. Edmund Pendleton, right? Maria Pinckney, all of these things. Maria Pinckney, she writes for her nieces and nephews. She writes a class on the Constitution. Well, I include and cleaned it up and made it where it's legible. The class she had on the Constitution, and she made this for her little nieces and nephews. And I would bet that most professors of American history would have difficulty passing that class today.
Oh, I bet. I'd love to. I know the next 2 books I'm getting then, and I appreciate that. Now, if anybody's interested, knows that is that at the JBS site or is that on Amazon?
You can go, Amazon. So the new Madison one is this, From Last Rights to Bill of Rights, the miraculous life and legacy of James Madison, which is just, I included one reviewer the other day. It made me so happy because he included in his review, he's like, Wolverton, for the first time in at least 100 years, included information on Mr. Madison's faith and how important it was to him. And that's true. Most biographers don't focus on James Madison's deep religious faith. And anyway, they're both available on Amazon or shopjbs.org. By Compact, Not Command. Both of them are cheaper on shopjbs.org because, that's the outlet for Western Islands.
Right.
And that's the Western Islands is the publishing house that I run for the JBS. And but you can get them. You can get it on my Amazon for a couple of dollars more each, if you want. 2 days instead of a week.
Right.
But I'm telling you that if you want, people always are. The founding fathers were not religious people. Boy, read this new biography. I included a whole section on Madison's religious faith and how deep it was, and how his testimony of the resurrection, for example, that you won't read anywhere else. And I'm glad to put it in my book and excited. And by Compact, Not Command, the one that just came out, this one, boy, if you want to get yourself some ammunition, and that's what I call it. This is ammunition in the war against statists,
Yep.
in the war against those who claim the federal government is superior to the state government. Boy, I'm going to tell you this. This one essay, "The Danger Not Over," by Edmund Pendleton. I mean, it's just, you read it and you're like, why? And then you instantly understand when you read. And I don't know how many pages the book is. It's not that big. It's, what is it? It's, let's see, 229 pages.
That's pretty short for a book like that. That's great.
Yeah, it includes Abel Upshur, John Taylor of Caroline, includes Madison, Jefferson. Like I said, it includes Mariah Pinckney, includes Edmund Pendleton's essay, Madison's report of 1800. I mean, you'll read it and you'll instantly be like, okay, now I can argue against these people that claim the federal government, because most of us who believe in the sovereignty of the states have a difficult time arguing against those who believe in the supremacy of the federal government, because we all went to the same indoctrination camp for 12, 13 years.
Yep.
And we have a difficult, even though in our, we understand intuitively, we have a difficult time articulating our position. Well, that book, and you can mark it up and have it be your, what the Romans called your vade mecum, carry with you. And you can just carry this around with you and mark it up and be prepared for those people who say, well, the Constitution, Article 6 says, and you can just get right to it and boom, blow that out of the water. And that's what it was written for. It was written so that people on our side, the right side, and I mean that in both ways, that they will understand and they'll be able to articulate the arguments in favor of state sovereignty, state independence, all of that sort of stuff. And it's a little book. It reads, I mean, our people at Western Islands are the best, and it looks nice, and it's laid out really easy to read, and it's very cheap. Either way you get it, it's very cheap. Like I say, it's a little cheaper at Shop JBS, but shopjbs.org, but you can get it on Amazon and get it tomorrow or the next day.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. And like I say, those are definitely the next two. I had forgotten about the matter of fact, I think we were supposed to have you on a while back, and something came up, and we were going to talk about your Madison book. So I apologize about forgetting that.
No,
but this other one I wasn't even tracking. I didn't even know you were working on that one.
Yeah, well, the problem was because I wrote that earlier Madison biography, and the publisher at the time, whenever I submitted the manuscript, wanted to scrub out a bunch of stuff that was really important to me. And so I was like, okay, to get it published, I was just willing to do. Well, then now I started, or I guess it's been a couple of years now. I'm like, you know what? I'm going to rewrite it, put back in the things that are important to me. Plus, I'm going to expand it with the chapter on Madison's religious faith. And yeah, that made me so happy, and makes me happy that people, when they read it, the first thing they always say is, I never knew that about James Madison, because there is, James Madison is the redheaded stepchild of the founding fathers. I mean, no one talks about him really. And he, as Jefferson said, he was the smartest man in the room, no matter what room he was in. And, his faith was central to that. And people, every time someone mentions they've read that book, they're like, I didn't know that about Madison. Well, now you do.
And I'm sure there's others that way that we were told, they weren't really religious. I'm sure that's the case across the board.
We were told that they were essentially Satan worshipers. I mean, in school we're taught not to revere them, but to revile them in school. I mean, it's so weird that 90% of Americans, let their kids go to those indoctrination camps.
Absolutely.
They not only do it, but they pay for the privilege through taxation to have their kids taught to revile the founding fathers. We are, as Machiavelli said, as Harrington said, republics can't survive that.
Nope, absolutely.
Republics cannot survive that kind of thing.
Yeah, and we're well down that road. So I'm hoping that we can.
Amen.
I'm hoping we can turn it back somehow. And those kind of books, you got to have that, because you're not going to go off to some college and get that. You're not going to get that at Hillsdale. Okay, Hillsdale's
Oh,
good in a lot of ways, but you're not going to get that at Hillsdale.
well, yeah. I mean, that's the reason it was so funny because I went on a speaking tour. I just got back, Ohio and Michigan, and people were asking me, "Oh, you should teach this class at Hillsdale." I said, "Well, I was offered a job at Hillsdale teaching my founder's recipe class, but I would have to never mention Lincoln's tyranny."
Ah,
And I said, "Well, I'm not doing that.
yep.
You count me out. I'd rather be unemployed than lie." So yeah, Hillsdale. That's the only place you can get it. I'm telling you that by compact, not command. That's in the beginning, in the introduction. I say, you know, this is elementary stuff, man. This is the stuff that if you put the work in, you can understand this, and it becomes. And we have that way. We have a whole generation that you can pull them out of those indoctrination camps,
Yep.
give them a book like this, turn this into their American history lesson for, a month or whatever, and go through those documents line by line. Because then, Dave, because then you're not teaching them, well, Joe said this or
Right,
Joe said
right.
that.
Yeah.
Because if you like me, then what I say is fine. If you don't, then what I say, you automatically discount it.
Right.
Well, here, I'm just putting in the words of the people who lived
Yeah.
through the foundation, the Constitution, and what they said, how they said it was meant to function.
Yep, absolutely. Well, hey, we're soon going to celebrate our 249th birthday this coming Friday.
Yep.
When we think of the Revolution, we think of the war, and it's in this case the American Revolution. But the Revolution really began years before the war, and I don't mean necessarily violent revolution. Can you explain the revolution in thinking that took place in America before the actual fighting started?
Yeah, I'll start it by one of my favorite quotations. I'll read to you from John Adams. He wrote in a letter to Mr. Niles. He says, "What do we mean by the American Revolution? Do we mean the American War? The Revolution was effected before the war commenced. The Revolution was in the minds and the hearts of the people, a change in their religious sentiments, their duties and obligations. This radical change in the principles, sentiments, and affections of the people was the real American Revolution." I don't think could be any clearer than that. When someone wrote a letter, 1818, asking Mr. Adams, well, how'd the revolution start? His first question is, well, what do you mean? Revolution. You mean the fighting? The fighting, that's easy to say. It started April 19th, 1775
Yep.
on, Lexington Green. That's easy to say. But the revolution, he said, started way before that, when the hearts of the people changed, their religious sentiments changed.
How did they change? I'm just curious, the religious sentiments.
Well, they came to understand that all these things that they believed, that it required, as he says, there was a duty and obligation attached to those beliefs. As the good book itself says, if you believe these things, see that you do them. So this is what happened. It's not that they went from being atheists to being Christian. No, they were mostly Christian, but they came to understand through their constant study of the Bible. I mean, Alexis de Tocqueville in 1830, when he got here. Now, 1830, obviously after the Constitution for, good, 50 years nearly. But he got off the boat from France and he said, the Bible is the perfume in this country. Everybody reads the Bible this, the Bible that. And so they began, as Adam said, they began to feel, do you know what? These things that we believe, there's a duty and obligation to act on those things. And we cannot allow, if we believe that all men were created equal and endowed by their Creator with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, well, then that's not ours. We didn't create it. It wasn't the power of the people that created this liberty. It was a gift from God. Therefore, we had a duty and an obligation as Christians to defend that, to retain that, to demonstrate to deity that we were grateful for his gift. That was the change. The change was, you know, as others have said before, they got off their knees and grabbed a gun, right?
Praise the
You,
Lord
you
and pass the ammo.
right. You pray like everything depends on God, but you fight like everything depends on you. And so they did that, and that was the change. And he calls it a radical change. And but he also mentions the opinions and sentiments. And this is a thing that people get, you know, it's so difficult to explain to people because, like we were saying before, we were all taught in the same indoctrination camps. So I'll read you this little thing here. Um, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to Henry Lee in 1825 because Henry Lee wanted to teach his grandchildren the sources that Jefferson used, because it was Richard Henry Lee that introduced the proposal that became the Declaration of Independence. It was, if you've ever seen 1776, the musical, right? It had to be a man from Virginia, right?
Right.
So Richard Henry Lee, he wrote to Thomas Jefferson and said, what were your influences so that I can make sure my grandkids read those same books? And Jefferson writes, now think about this, the elementary books of public right, such as Aristotle, Cicero, John Locke, and Algernon Sidney. Now, my question would be, how many parents that truly desire a restoration of liberty in this country, who truly consider themselves patriots, who truly want to raise a James Madison, a George Washington, how many of them are teaching or even giving access to Aristotle, Cicero, John Locke, and Algernon Sidney? And yet they seek to give the Declaration to their kids and explain it to them when they don't know where it came from themselves. I can't teach what I don't know. And so, one of the big things is, the Founder's Recipe book that I wrote. Again, you don't have to like me to appreciate the scientific fact that these are the 37 men most often quoted by the founding generation. You don't have to like me at all, but it's an irrefutable fact. I have studied close to 200,000 documents written by the founding generation, and they mention these men over, and it's names that you've never heard of. And so you have Jefferson writing to a friend of his for the purpose of making sure that the next generation studies the right books, and you have Aristotle, Cicero, John Locke, and Algernon Sidney. I bet you couldn't go to well, you're here in Clarksville, right? I bet
Paris.
You couldn't go down. Paris, that's right. I bet you couldn't go over to Austin P and go to an American history professor. And I think Austin P is an awesome school. I really do. If I lived in that area, I'd have no problem with kids going to that school compared to other ones.
Right.
I bet you couldn't go to Austin P to an American history. I bet they couldn't fill an index card with what they know about those four people: Aristotle, Cicero, John Locke, and Algernon Sidney. And I guarantee you 3/4 of it would be what they know about John Locke.
I was about to say, I've heard of the others, but now Algernon Sidney, I've heard of him, but only recently.
Right there next to my book. That green book right there is my very first copy of his book, Discourses Concerning Government. And I'm telling you, this is the thing, Dave. When you read these books that our founding fathers read, page 1, I'm not exaggerating, brother. Page 1, you understand why, when the Marxists took over education in the early 1900s, why all this stuff was scrubbed from the curriculum. We went from studying history to studying social studies.
Right.
Right? That's what we went to doing. We went from studying English to studying language arts, nonsense and rubbish, because it's just like the money bags of the educrats, the people that took control. Rockefeller said, we don't want thinkers, we want workers.
Right. Right.
And you read page one, brother, even this new book, you take page one of the document that's included and you're instantly, I get it now. I get it. I'm convicted. Because you'll see instantly why people don't know these names, why people don't understand why we fought.
Right.
They don't understand. But that's because we were all taught in the same places, out of the same books. I mean, you think about how the fact that Ghislaine Maxwell's dad is one of the biggest publisher of textbooks on the planet, and maybe
I didn't know that. I did not know that. Wow.
And maybe you start to understand stuff like that, and you see the foundations that give money, right?
Oh yeah.
And you realize these foundations were there at the beginning, saying we've got to get these kids out of these parents' homes and educate them outside of the home because they're getting too much of that superstition, meaning religious faith.
Right. Right. And I would say it's not education; it's indoctrination. But I do want to say this so people understand the founder's recipe. You have the 37 most quoted individuals that the founders look to. So you don't have to go out and buy the separate works of all these people. I mean, that's fine if you want to, but you can at least get an overview in the founder's recipe.
Yeah, I call it, my wife's a chef, and I call it an amuse-bouche. It's something that, just a little taste. Just a little taste of all these 37 guys. And I tell you at the beginning, I show you at the beginning the scientific data, the fact that, I've read and collected nearly 200,000 documents.
Wow.
And just taking those names. And then I just put a little selection and you read it. And it's, Dave, that's the thing. If we could get people to just read, man. Leaders are readers. And if you get someone to open any of these books, you get someone read, the elementary books of Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, and Sidney. You're going to read that and it's going to be different. Your life will be different. And how our life will be different is the same way that Mr. Adams said life was different that precipitated the American Revolution, because the sentiments, the principle, these things started being taught. And why? People say, well, that sure is, serendipitous that right before the revolution starts, this generation was taught these things. I'm like, or it was the grace of God.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or you could say God sent a generation of women who had children and they raised those children on these principles. And when it came time for those young men to give action to their beliefs, they were ready to do it. They were steeped in this stuff. So people that like to say that, well, it sure is accidental. It sure is, convenient. No, well, I don't know if it's convenient that a bunch of people got killed in a war to establish our independence, something we never gave away in the first place. But it is, to me, the grace of God that we got sent the best blood of the 18th century, Jefferson, Madison, Washington, Adams. And people say to me just the other night, well, Joe, I gave a speech on the founder's recipe, and guys, a really good crowd in Cleveland, Ohio. And the guy said, well, how come we've never had another generation? Because we've never read the same books.
Good point.
We've been substituting salt for sugar and wondering why the cake isn't sweet. It's simple as that. Well, it's granular and it's white. Yeah, that doesn't mean it's the right thing. Yeah. But that's the thing, Dave. So if we read what the founders read, we're liable to do what the founders did. And the people who are still in charge of setting and directing and managing the curriculum in the United States still refuse to put those things. You should see, when I was a teacher, when I was a high school teacher at a charter school, which was essentially a public school, but privately owned.
Right.
I was told don't teach the Iliad anymore.
Why?
Well, if you've read the Iliad, you realize it makes boys want to be heroes. And
Ah, can't
they
have
said
that
instead of
masculine toxicity, right?
right, yeah,
Yeah.
it's all full of it is full of masculine toxicity. They're like, no, if you want to teach the Greeks and the Romans, teach about their gods, have them learn about Zeus and Hercules and stuff, and that's just ridiculous. And you read the Iliad and you read these words that they say and you get inspired, and they're like, yeah, let's not have you read the Iliad with the kids anymore. I want workers, not thinkers, man. Thinkers are going to think their way out of what we're in.
Right.
But you said you hope. I know that we are going to get that generation, that second generation sons of liberty. They're going to be taught by mothers at home, outside of these indoctrination camps, and they're going to get to the age where they can start having political influence, and they're going to turn this ship around and guide us back into that port of liberty. And I know that for a fact, but we just have to do the heavy lifting to get them to where they can do that. And part of that is, like you said, like tonight, knowing where, for example, where Jefferson got the ideas. Did they just, appear in his head one day, which would be awesome? I mean, inspiration from God is awesome. But did he have any resources from which he drew? Yes, and he named them. But and then you go, for example, to the University of Virginia when it was started by Jefferson and Madison. People forget that, Madison and Jefferson did that together, and they made a list and they said any young man, because back then young women would have no reason to go to college. They said any young man who matriculates at the University of Virginia had to have read the Declaration of Independence, the Federalist Papers, Algernon Sidney, and John Locke. You had to have read them.
Wow.
And you had to have read Mr. Madison's basically the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions.
Okay. Good.
So you had to have read before you can enroll. They would have you sit there in front of a bank of about, 3 or 4 professors, and they would ask you to explain to them, to demonstrate to them that you had a knowledge of these authors and what they wrote and what they contributed. Boy, I don't think most professors would even get into college today.
No.
If that was still the entrance exam required, I bet most professors would fail that entrance exam.
I bet you're right. How did the colonists understand their rights as British citizens under the unwritten British Constitution?
Well, okay, and this is a thing that I do that confuses people, but I'm glad I confuse people on this. We were taught that there is no written British Constitution. That isn't true.
Oh,
That's not true. There is a written British Constitution, but it's spread across several documents. We have the Constitution. Right. You can get this little booklet and you can turn in it, and there's the whole of the Constitution is in there. England, they don't have that. They have Magna Carta, the Petition of Right, the Bill of Rights. They have several documents which collectively constitutes, hence the word Constitution, which collectively constitutes their government.
And they were created over years, not all at one time.
Right. And those are put together in the constituting of their government. So they do have a written constitution. They just don't have one written at the same time version like we do. Right.
Okay. Well,
that's what we don't have that. They don't have that. They still don't have that. And I hope they never do have that, because what they have is, now what 800 and something year old document in Magna Carta, and that's what the founders looked to. They basically looked to 2 paragraphs of Magna Carta. One said essentially no taxation without representation. That was essentially. Now, it didn't use those words, but that's what it meant. You can't be taxed without your approval or without your representative's approval. Okay, so that was one paragraph. Second paragraph they looked to said These rights belong to all Englishmen and all their descendants forever, wherever they live throughout the globe.
Okay.
Well, that covered most of the Americans, right? Any
Right.
British American that, and so the Americans argue we've never, revoked, repealed Magna Carta. Well, so we can't be taxed without our consent. And the Magna Carta still covers us because it covers all Englishmen everywhere, no matter where they live. We happen to live in Virginia. What difference does that make? If we live in Virginia or London, it makes no difference with regard to our rights.
Okay.
And of course, so that's one place. They looked to the English Constitution. And right now, someone's going to be saying to themselves, there is no English Constitution. There is. It's just not in one document, it's in several documents. They look to Magna Carta, and I have several articles on the New American about the Magna Carta and how our fathers look to it. And you can look for yourself. Go look at the papers of Sam Adams or John Adams, and you'll see, gosh, the Magna Carta quoted all the time during the Revolutionary period, right? It's like, you can't do this violate. And that's why when Jefferson made the Declaration, when they listed all the offenses of the king, that's where, the king can't do these things because all of them violate Magna Carta or the Petition of Right, or, that sort of thing. And so they were saying where did he get those ideas? Well, those ideas, he didn't just come up with them. Right. He came up with them because he said, here's the things that we're promised in the English Constitution, and here's the way the king is violating those rights. And of course, and perhaps most important, and not perhaps, most importantly, and you see this in the records of the Second Continental Congress, the Congress that declared independence, you have them say, John Dickinson gets up and he says in the Second Continental Congress, he says, I don't find my rights in any musty parchment. He said, my rights are mine because I'm a child, a creation of God. My rights, I do not have to find my right to keep what is mine in some musty document, on some, as he called it, musty parchment. I don't have to find my right to keep the fruits of my labor written in some document. I have that right as a natural inherent right as being a son of God. I keep what I create. I reap what I sow. What is mine is mine. I have absolute, and Blackstone had written it just a dozen years or so before. Blackstone said, property is the ultimate right.
Yeah.
Property is the difference in everything. And property means if it's yours to dispose of however you see fit, period. And no one has a right to it unless you agree to give someone a right to it. And so in our case, we've come so far from that, man, to where not only do people say we pay taxes. That's not true. We don't. Taxes are taken from us. We don't pay them.
Yeah.
We used to pay taxes in this country, but we don't pay taxes now. The government and your employer are in collusion to take that money from you before you ever get it.
Yep.
You are allowed that portion of the product of your work. You're allowed that portion that the government will give you, period. That's it. And our founding fathers, yeah, they wouldn't have stood for that. They didn't stand for it, did they? I mean,
No,
I guess
no.
they did stand for it because they got up at 4:30 in the morning and got their hunting rifles out there and stood at, face to face with, one of the world's most powerful professional armies.
Yep.
And that, that brings me to, I did a video a while ago that I just happened upon this, and I thought it would be something that y'all would like. It was an interview with the last known survivor of the Battle of Lexington and Concord.
Oh, wow.
So interesting, right? This guy was in his 90s, and his name was Levi Preston. And so this guy wants to see. Yeah, he was 91 when he was interviewed in 1843, if you can believe that.
Wow.
1843, a student at Dartmouth named Mellon Chamberlain was doing a research paper on the American independent war for independence, and he somehow got a hold of this Levi Preston, who was 91, and you can read the story, but he goes on and he says, "Well, what at the end of it all, Captain Preston?" Because he says, "Did y'all go out because of Sydney and Harrington?" Which, I mean, a couple of names that here he is mentioning the two names he mentions are Harrington and Sydney. Today, people will be like, "Who?" But you can see a 19-year-old student, knowing those names and thinking, well, those are the reason they fought. And he goes on, he said, was it the Bible? Was it this? He's like, and the guy's like, well, yeah, that had something to do with it. But he said, at the end of it, he says, what was the crux of the issue? And the testimony borne by Captain Preston, 91 years old, he says, young man, what we meant in going for those redcoats was this. We had always been free. We meant to be free always, and they meant that we shouldn't.
Wow.
That was enough for them. We had always been free. We intended on always being free, and they wanted to stop us from being free. That's enough reason.
Absolutely.
I mean, and anybody, if you look up interview Levi Preston, you can read that. Interview Captain Levi Preston. You'll find that somewhere out there. I just have. What's that?
We got a couple of questions on text line here. Let me pull them up here, if I can.
There's a lot of places that have it. I use the one that I had from historical collection of those documents that I collected. But I'm sure if you do it, just put interview Captain Levi Preston, it'll come up somewhere.
I do have a question from one of the listeners, and I wanted to know what your thought of the book, The Jeffersonians by Kevin Gutzman.
I haven't read it. I'm gonna be honest with you. I haven't read it. Typically, Kevin Gutzman and we agree on about 95% of things, though. But I haven't read the book, The Jeffersonians by Kevin Gutzman. So I can't say, I don't want to say, oh, it's wonderful. I don't know what it says. I am a huge, I'm an old Republican, as they call them. I'm the three Johns, right?
Right.
Calhoun, John Calhoun, John Taylor, and now my mind just went blank, but the other John.
Okay.
I believe in the old Republicans, the tertium quid, as they were called back in the day, the third way. Yeah, John Taylor of Caroline. If he said it, I'm pretty sure it's right. So, and I imagine Gutzman agrees with that, but I don't know. I don't know what he said in his book.
And I've got some other questions in reference to this. We'll get a little bit further down. So were there other things that they understood as rights that had always been rights, had always been what part of the freedom they enjoyed, that now Parliament and the King decided, well, we're just not going to allow that? Let's talk about some of that.
Well, I mean, you read the list in the Declaration of Independence. He makes a very clear list,
right,
of things that they believed to be,
long train of abuses.
Yeah, the long train of abuses and usurpations. It's like they believed these things to be. One I like to talk about that people, you always hear people talk about the Stamp Act, and that was a huge deal. Don't misinterpret what I'm saying.
Right.
But the White Pine Act. The White Pine Act. So the British had fought a 7-year, what the world calls a 7 years war. We called it the French and Indian War over here, but part of the 7-year war with France. And they doubled their national debt in order to fight this global war against France. Well, one of the things that they suffered from was a lack of good timber to build new ships. So, well, looky here, we've got these colonies in America, and they are chock full of good shipbuilding timber.
Right.
And so they passed this thing called the White Pine Act, where soldiers or agents of the British government would simply come onto someone's land, put a ribbon around trees, and then along would come guys that would fell those trees and drag them out.
Wow.
And you would have people, and that's the White Pine Act, and you would have these colonists. Where did that come from? And that really is one of those things that just set off that powder keg. Is like, you've got government agents coming onto my land, telling me what I have to do with my property.
Right.
And if I don't do it willingly, they're going to cut the trees down and drag them off against my will.
Yeah. You mentioned the Stamp Act, and of course that was a big issue, but if I remember correctly, when they repealed the Stamp Act, after enough protest, after it was, you could say, after the colonists nullified it, okay, because they did.
Right. That's exactly what happened.
They did nullify it. They later passed some other acts, the Townsend Act, which was probably worse, but the bigger thing they did was the Declaratory Act. And that's one of the things that really set them off. But hey, we reserve the right to legislate for you on anything whatsoever.
Right. Which basically is what we're living through today. If you think about the Stamp Act, think about this, brother. If you go and read the Stamp Act, the original one, and I used to do this with my students at university, and it would blow their mind. I said, let's throw up on the screen here the Stamp Act, and let's read it. If you read it, you come to find out that it is no more or no less than what happens with every transaction that we make every day at a store. Because you get a receipt, right?
Right.
A little piece of paper, a stamp. Because that's what it was. It was a stamp. Sometimes it was a piece of paper. Sometimes it was a physical stamp. But it was a piece of paper showing what? That you bought from a vendor that was approved.
Right.
Using the approved currency, right?
Yeah.
That you paid the approved tax. Now you look at your receipt. That's what that is, because it's saying this business is giving you a receipt because if you look on the wall, they'll have permission from the king to do business on the wall behind it, right?
Yeah.
Call it like you like, but there should be no one between me and the guy selling me apples, but the guy with the apples, me and him. Well, if you go to a store today, go to Kroger, go to Circle K, whatever, you'll see the king's permission on the wall to do business. You'll then get this receipt showing how much it was, what the tax collected was, right? And that's the Stamp Act. We are living the Stamp Act. And because we bought from an approved seller, paying the approved tax, right?
Right.
Using the approved currency. Because, if they say, you couldn't go in there and pay with, I don't know. You couldn't go to Circle K and be like, hey, I want a Coke Zero, man. What do you take for it? No, you have to use you laugh, but that's how it should be. I should be able to go in there and say, hey, man, I got this, I don't know. I got this thing and I'll trade it for you for a Coke. And he's like, heck yeah, man, I want one of those. There you go. We're all done. But no, we live the Stamp Act. You've got to buy from approved vendors at the approved tax rate, right? And you've got to show you use the approved currency. Well, then what do you have? You have the colonists nullify that because they're like, yeah, we're not doing that. And then you're right. They had ultimately, and this is, you talk about Townsend. This is a guy, Charles Townsend. They called him Champagne Charlie because he showed up to Parliament drunk so often. They called him Champagne Charlie. Well, Champagne Charlie tells them, you know what? We're going to get the honey out of the hive without disturbing the bees. He's like, that Stamp Act was stupid, and whoever did that deserves to be run out on a rail. He's like, we're going to get the honey without disturbing the bees. Well, he got stung and got stung severely because his name, the Townsend Act, and then you get the Declaratory Act, which, again, we live today.
Yep.
I can't build a house without the king's permit, period, without the king's permission. And then I pay the king for the rest of my life for position for the right
To live there.
for permission to live on property I've already paid for.
Yeah.
I pay the king for the rest of my life,
Yeah.
and my descendants will do the same. If they live, you're going to pay property tax for the rest of your life. We live the Declaratory Act and the Stamp Act. We live it. It's just today we're not taught what it is. And so, but you know what, Dave, I'll be honest with you, just me and you and the lamppost. I don't think if we understood that we were living with the Stamp Act and the Declaratory Act, I don't know that most people would care. As long as the Wi-Fi signal's good, as long as I can keep gas $3 or under, come on, man, I don't care.
Well, that's sad, but you're probably true. Probably right. But if you look at the long train of abuses and usurpations, I think that when I look at that, and I've read it, and we don't actually have a slide on it right now, but I encourage, hey, you know what? If you haven't read it, 4th of July, go read it. Go read the long train of abuses and usurpations, and that's what led us to the War for Independence.
Right.
I would say, looking at that King Charles and England at the time are not even comparable to the garbage that we deal with here in this country under the federal government.
The founding fathers would beg to be under the rule of George III if they had to live here today. They would understand this. I wrote an article about this, several articles about this, about do we need, because there's several groups calling for a second Declaration of Independence. We need to reassert this. I think we just need to learn what's in it and apply it, right?
Right.
And nothing there is. I'll read you this from Mr. Madison that's on this point, actually. He said, if there be a principle that ought not be questioned within the United States, it is that every nation has a right to abolish an old government and establish a new one. This principle is not only recorded in every public archive, written in every American heart, and sealed with the blood of American martyrs, but is the only lawful tenure by which the United States hold their existence as a nation. If your government stops protecting your life, liberty, and property and starts destroying your life, liberty, and property, then Madison says that is the most basic principle there, should be written in the heart of every American, and for which the blood of American martyrs has been spilled, is that it is your right to abolish that old government and find new guardians for your life, your liberty, and your property. And so you can read those things, and in these articles, if you just Google my name, and don't use Google because they don't like pulling my stuff up, but use DuckDuckGo or Brave or one of them.
Right.
And if you Google my name and Declaration of Independence, I've written about each one of these, and I put underneath it, sound familiar, because we're living through all of these things again.
Yep.
And again, it just comes down to how we respond, Dave. It's how do we respond? Our founding fathers, and Jefferson says in there, we didn't take this lightly. This isn't some light and transient cause, he says. This isn't just, hey, we had a wild hair one day and decided, it'd be cool, fight one of the world's most powerful empires. No, this was years of them writing letters. Hey, come on now. Yeah. Hey, please understand. We want to be good subjects. Hey, and that's why Sam Adams says, don't ever call me a rebel. I'm not the one, he said, who rebelled against the Constitution. George and Parliament were the ones who rebelled against the Constitution, meaning the English Constitution.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's like, I'm not a rebel. I didn't rebel against anything other than tyranny, I suppose. And he's like, I don't think you can rebel against tyranny, because tyrant by definition is a rebel. He's restarting the war of, do I have the right to be free or not?
Well, I can see why the powers that be don't want this out there, and they don't really want to teach the American Revolution. They don't really want to teach what the founders thought, what they said, what they learned, what the sources were. I can understand that. Now, a little more technical question having to do with the actual war, the actual fighting. So, and I've heard different numbers over the years, so I'm just curious. What percentage of people actually fought for independence versus what percentage were loyal?
Well, it depends on what. See, this is where you get in. The reason is we share a vocabulary, but not a dictionary.
Okay.
Yeah. What does it mean to fight? Do you mean like took up arms?
Right.
Very small number. If you mean fought as in supported the American cause, well, then the number gets bigger.
Right.
You know, because and how do you even measure that? Because you've got a substantial population of Quakers who were conscientious objectors.
Right.
Yet they would do all they could to house and feed and have hospitals essentially for the Americans fighting the British.
Right.
So how do you include that? But the number that stayed loyal, like as in absolutely would rather have their property taken or would rather go back to England, that number was definitely less than a third. I mean, that I think even putting a third on it is high because again, it's one of those things, man. How do you measure it? It's difficult to measure, and we never can know what was in someone's heart or in their mind at the time.
Right.
So when so-and-so writes a letter saying, I can't take up arms, does that mean he agreed with the British or did he have a religious objection to killing? So we can't really know, but I would say if you wanted to say what percentage of people in America in one way or another opposed the Declaration of Independence, the secession from the British Empire, because that's what it was, right?
Right.
We had 13 republics secede from England. I would say the number who actively opposed that was probably a fifth.
Okay.
Probably 20% of Americans. And in different places, it was higher or lower, right?
Right.
Unfortunately, down south, we had a lot higher percentage of loyalists, right? Nonetheless, still sufficient to to help win the war. But yeah, I would say if you counted them all, one fifth would probably be right about the number, about 20%.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean that the other 80% were out there with a gun ready to go to war. That's not what that means.
Right.
That just means they didn't oppose the effort to secede from the British Empire.
Right. And you mentioned 13 colonies that seceded or declared independence. As well, you well know, and I just want to bring this up for the audience, some that may not have realized it, that, there were states or colonies that declared their independence before the Declaration of Independence. And matter of fact, I think some of what Jefferson wrote, he probably borrowed. I think it's from the Virginia Declaration.
Yeah, Virginia, Rhode Island. Rhode Island was the first, if you can believe it. Rhode Island, they were always good about that, boy. They hated any sort of oppression. And there's a whole matter of fact, I keep saying I wrote an article about this just so easier than trying to recite the article and take up time. I wrote an article about the state declarations and the state constitutions that existed before, because it helps people understand. Because if you look at like the JBS, our pocket constitution comes with a Declaration of Independence.
Right.
And, if you read this, boy, you really come away, and if you read it closely and carefully, you come away with a different understanding. I mean, because we left the emphasis where it was. And when they say that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states,
yep,
and that they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce. Now listen, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. When they say that they are free from the state, these states are free and independent, and the political connection between them and the state of Great Britain
Right.
is totally dissolved, that tells you what they thought about each one of these colonies. They were each one free and independent republics,
Yep.
on the same stature as Great Britain. He used the same word to describe the government of Great Britain as he did the government of and if you look at the Treaty of Paris that ended it,
It says that.
you'll
Yep.
it says that.
Yep.
You'll see. That's why I wrote it. I wrote an article one time that says King George knew more about federalism than the president today does. Because King George recognized I got to have 13 peace treaties essentially.
Yep. And the states operated, well, during the Revolution, at least part of the Revolution, and I wanted to ask you about this, they operated under the Articles of Confederation, but that didn't pass until March of 81, and the war ends in 81. As far as most of the fighting, it's 2 more years before they have a treaty. So they didn't really operate under the Articles all that much because it wasn't ratified till late in the game, or not. I mean,
Well, right. There was a holdout state that held on till then. It had actually been ratified by most of them a few years prior to that.
Right.
So they were operating under the Continental Congress and the Confederation Congress. But the matter of that, the thing with a couple of things, I guess. Number one is they considered, and because it was, the Articles of Confederation was the capital C Constitution.
Right.
Just like this document, if they'd have had this kind of thing in 1783, this little book would have had the Constitution for the United States, and you'd have opened it and it'd been the Articles of Confederation.
Right.
Because they considered that the Constitution, right? And it had a way to amend it and all of that stuff. Right. It had a definition of the powers granted to Congress and all of this. So to them, that was the Constitution. That was the Constitution. And we need to, because we're not taught that, right? We're just taught that it was some kind of treaty or something, but all we ever hear in school, I don't know about you, but all I ever knew about the Articles, they didn't work.
Yeah, that's all you hear. They didn't work.
That's all I was taught.
Yeah,
they didn't work, and so we had to have the Constitution. But that's rubbish. They worked just fine to get us through a war with one of the most powerful empires. So to say it didn't work and that we needed that's not how it was. But yeah, that was the Articles of Confederation. But also the second point I was going to make is, and this is one that people find really tricky, because we are also taught that we're supposed to, from the time you're 4 or 5 years old, you stand up, you face the flag, one nation, indivisible.
Right. Yeah, that's a much later edition, actually written by a socialist, if I'm not mistaken.
Right, written by a socialist for the purpose of selling, of his brother-in-law selling flags, who had a flag-making company. And he himself wrote it, a socialist. I wrote an article about that too. Surprise, surprise.
Bellamy was the last name, if I'm not mistaken.
What's that? Bellamy.
Bellamy.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. That's right. So actually, the brother of the guy who wrote that, what was that famous socialist book about going back? Oh, I can't remember what it's called now. But anyway, his brother was a famous author. Anyway, my point is that, we were taught this indivisible one nation. Not a single founding fathers would allow their kids to repeat that.
Right.
Because it's so absolutely contrary to the principles established in the Declaration of Independence. It's so anti-Declaration of Independence. Not a single founding father would have let their kid do that. Second of all, it teaches us, it grinds into our heads the idea that it's one nation and it can never be anything else.
Right. Right.
Well, Benjamin Franklin, after the war, near the end of the war, he made a whole statement. He said, well, why are we uniting anyway for anything? Why do we need to stay United States? We're done. We've come together to defeat our common enemy. Our common enemy is defeated. Why are we stay? That doesn't make any sense for us to stay together.
I've never heard that. I
We've
have
done
never
what
heard
we
that. Wow.
yeah we've done what we set out to do. Yay us! Congratulations to us. We've secured our independence, meaning Pennsylvania, Virginia, New York. We're all free and independent states. We won, and now let's do your thing. But it was one of those things where then you had powerful people say, well, if we unite, we're stronger economically and we're stronger militarily. And that argument won. And I'm not saying I'm against that, but I'm against, and every founding father except for Alexander Hamilton
Right.
was against the concept of the United States being a nation. It was and you can read it. Read Federalist 39.
Now,
It was
I got to ask this. So
Yeah.
I'd always understood that, and this has always been my understanding, that the Federalists, generally speaking, wanted a stronger central government
Right.
versus the Anti-Federalist.
That's right.
And obviously, we know Hamilton wanted a monarchy, but he was alone on that. Although Adams wasn't really far behind him in a lot of ways. But I'd always understood it as some wanted a strong national government versus the others who didn't. And I thought even Washington wanted one country. That had always been my understanding.
Well, there was, except for, like I say, except for Hamilton, who did favor a monarchy with a Senate with a life tenure, right? And that you could hand down to your son, by the way.
Right.
Can you imagine? But no, what they wanted, yes, they wanted a tighter, a more powerful central government. That is to say, what we would call federal government. They wanted a stronger federal government. None of them. You can read in the records of the debate in Philadelphia,
Right.
and read the records of the ratification. If you're going to read something and you want to just get fired up, read the ratification convention in Virginia. You can go online and get the record.
Yeah, I've read that one, or parts of it anyway.
So you see that the word consolidation.
It's a dirty word.
It's a dirty word. The anti-federalists are constantly, they're trying to consolidate us into one country. They're trying to consolidate. But the federalists answer, no way. We are not doing that. We just want a federal government that is able to do things in a more expeditious, a more dynamic, a quicker way, without having to go through 13 approvals. He's like, we don't want to, none of them would have said, yes, we want to abolish the states and establish one giant country. No, but what they did say is we want maybe to shift the power more to the federal government, but not with the concept of making it, the United States is. It always was the United States are, right? To them, it was and you can read Federalist 39 is a perfect example where Madison says, this is a confederacy of independent sovereign republics. This is what we want. We do not want a consolidated government.
Right.
We do not want that. And so, yes, there were many of the founders, Madison among them.
Initially, especially,
Who said we need to bump it a little bit toward, move the needle a little bit toward a stronger federal government. But can you imagine? They would never have a concept that you would have to, eternally pay for permission to live on your own property. They would never have a concept that you'd have to go and get permission from the king to dig a pond on your property. This is not what and so when people say that today, I'm like, okay, yes, comma. They wanted, but they would never have tolerated the things that, because you can see what they were willing to tolerate if you read the dadgum Declaration.
Yep.
Having July 4th and having fireworks and having a grilling out and everything without reading this document, that's sacrilege. That's blasphemy, because you're just partying. You're eating fruit on trees you didn't dig and drinking the delicious water of wells you didn't dig. You need to get in there, read that document, and do like Madison said. Remember that the blood of martyrs secured your freedom, right? That are written on the fleshy tablets of your heart should be the fact that the government serves you, not the other way around. And if things get flipped, it's your obligation as Adams, as we read from Adams. It's your duty, your religious duty and your religious obligation
And
to
that,
get rid of tyrants.
that kind of answers actually my last question on this is how we restore or preserve what the founders pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor to acquire, because we are nowhere near what they gave us in any way, shape, or form. And we even have a whole different mindset. For example, they were very concerned about standing armies. They were totally against standing armies. Well, we've never known anything but a standing army.
That's right.
And we're all fine and well with that.
Absolutely.
And just so many other things. I just don't think we really understand. There's a huge disconnect between us and the founding generation. I'm sure a lot of that relates to what they read and what they knew and what they believed, and the fact that they actually stood up for what they believed in. And so that's how we get it back, is we have to go back to the foundation, is we have to demand it and stand up for it. And we're not going to get over there. We're not going to get there overnight.
And you're not going to fight for something you don't understand.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you think you're free, you're not going to fight for it. Why are you going to fight for freedom?
Right.
It's like Machiavelli wrote. It's as impossible to make comfortable slaves fight for freedom as it would be to make a free man fight to be a slave.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen. If you think you're free, you're not going to join us in the fight for freedom.
Right.
And that's where we are today, is too many people. And the weird thing is, all of these men that the founding fathers read, every one of them mentioned as one of the last signs to a couple of things. Like Emer Devato makes it real clear. And he says, here's a couple of ways you can tell that your republic is done for. He's like, first, the effeminacy of your young men. If effeminacy gets a hold of your young men, you're out. You're done.
Right. Because
you're not going to have a generation that's going to take up a weapon and fight a tyrant. They're done. And second, if you get a generation that cares more for luxury than for liberty. If you get to that place, he's like, just sit back. Doesn't matter which deck chair you're on the Titanic, you're all going down. Right?
Yeah.
And so you look at us and you say, and that's not just one guy. They all, have essays and essays where they say effeminacy and luxury. You get those two things, those two tumors in your body politic, they will metastasize like that.
Well, we're there, and hopefully we can get it cut out real quick and do something about it.
Well, that's right. Nullification.
Absolutely.
That's the way we cut out the tumor of tyranny, is through the scalpel of nullification.
Absolutely. And then, of course, we have to put people in our state that will do that. And we don't, that's one of the problems
right.
at the state level. I mean, our governor, for instance, is pathetic. Most of our legislators are pathetic. And I would actually say most of the legislators across our country are pathetic. But, until the people demand more, that's what they're going to continue to get. I do want to hit one other thing here. I mentioned the standing army issue and that the founders were totally against that, although that's all we have ever known.
Right.
Is the executive. Now, tell me if I'm wrong or not, but another thing that they were worried about, and this comes when they're working on the Constitution, and another thing that they were very concerned about was, back when you had just a king, kings like war, okay?
Yes.
And kings could declare war on their own. Okay?
Why do kings like war?
Well, it helps them keep control. They gain taxes, they gain other riches, whatever it is they're going after. Plus, with when you're talking kings at that era, I mean, a lot of that was a family feud.
Kings of that era got to put taxes on.
Right, and that was a family feud too, though. So you had all kinds of jealousy going.
That's also true.
All kinds of things that you might get in a fight over. But they were leery of one guy being able to make the decision to go to war.
Right.
And I've read the 10th Amendment Center here lately, and it talked about the war powers, the understanding of the president at the time of the war powers. They talked about Washington. They talked about Adams in the quasi-French War. In Washington, they talked about some of the different Indian wars. that he was involved with. Adams, they talked about the quasi-war with France. Jefferson, they talked about the Barbary pirates. And then with Madison, talked a little bit about they talked about the War of 1812 and what the British, eventually had a second war with the British.
Yeah.
And to a man, their understanding of the war powers was that, okay, as commander-in-chief, I can always direct defense. So that's part of my requirement as commander-in-chief. If our forces are being attacked, we have to return fire. You repel fire with fire. But beyond that, beyond defensive action, they deferred to Congress. Now, I just want to say this, and I know this is not a popular position. Look, I'm one of those people who think we should have turned Iran to glass 40 years ago. Okay, we've had a lot of legitimate reasons, in my opinion, to take them on. But we haven't. As a matter of fact, we opened our borders, and I don't know how many we have here now. We didn't do anything after 79. We didn't do anything after 83 when they killed those Marines. They didn't do anything after they were killing our guys in Iraq. And now we took out their nukes at the president's order. And a lot of people say, well, he's the commander-in-chief. Article 2 says he's the commander-in-chief. But the Congress has to declare war. Well, he didn't declare war. Well, okay, wait a minute. But he committed an act of war. We were not at war. He committed an act of war. And, the enemy kind of usually gets a vote on that. So just because we say, we're just going to hit you, and that's all we're going to do, and you better not hit back, countries don't always listen to that. And so I just, and I understand, you're talking nukes here. I got that. But there was a resolution the other day. Now, no doubt in my mind, the Dems are pulling this out just because they want to get at Trump. It's like I said earlier, and it's like Calhoun said. The party out of power is going to hold up the Constitution when they're not in power and say that the other party's abusing it and vice versa. So I know they don't mean it because they never said anything about Obama. But think long term. Think beyond Trump. Do we want a president? And was this the intent, that a president can give any order when we're not technically at war with the country? I mean, I'm just curious. I want to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, you said it perfectly. I mean, the founding fathers, no one would have accepted this. Not at all would have accepted this. Bombing Iran when Iran has not done anything to attack us is absolutely unconstitutional. And I would ask this question, because I know I have friends, colleagues that, boy, if Trump does it, it must be right. He's playing 4D chess while the rest of us are playing checkers, right?
Right.
Well,
right.
First of all, come on now.
Yeah.
But second of all, define for yourself, what is patriotism? Is it allegiance to this or allegiance to a person in the White House? You got to define it.
Yeah.
Because if you decide that even though it hurts, my patriotism is defined by the Constitution and the Declaration, then sometimes you've got to oppose even people that you like because they're doing things contrary. Bombing Iran is contrary. It is unconstitutional any way you slice it, right? And that you don't have to say. The Democrats are fond, and some Republicans, unfortunately, are fond of, well, if you do one thing, it's a purity test, right? If you do one thing wrong, you're out.
Right.
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that everything President Trump has done is wrong because he did this wrong thing. But bombing Iran was unconstitutional, period. And you've got to decide for yourself and make it known, right? Cicero said, let everyone wear on his brow what he feels about the Constitution, because Rome had a constitution as well.
Right.
In other words, he was saying, do you support Caesar or do you support the Constitution?
Right.
And we've got to do that same thing. We've got to decide, do I support a man because I like how he acts, I like his personality, I like how he puts people in their place, and even when he does something unconstitutional, I'm gonna argue on his side?
Right.
Or do we support these documents that made us who we are,
Right.
the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution for the United States? Do we support them? And when someone acts within those boundaries, we support them, we salute them, we everything we can do. We shout it from the rooftops. But when they don't, we don't accept it. We've got to decide that, because this is leading us, like you said, down a scary road.
Yeah. Well, he's not always going to
Because-
be president. So for the people who think he's great, and look, I do not have either variation of TDS, Trump derangement syndrome. I don't have the one that hates everything he does. I like a
Right.
lot of the things he does. Okay.
Yeah.
I also don't have the one that, oh, anything he does is fine, and if you're against him, you're a traitor, you're unpatriotic, whatever. That's garbage. Okay. But I just think, okay, here's some of the arguments I hear. Well, we haven't declared war since 1945, but we've gone to war 125. Like, wait a minute, you're bragging about that? You're saying that's reason?
Yeah.
We got precedent. I'm like, yeah, like Supreme Court precedent. How's that worked out for us?
Well, look at, and this is the thing that frightens me, Dave. And this is the thing I think that, mustn't be mentioned. But of course, I'm going to mention it. When Congressman Thomas Massey calls out President Trump for violating the Constitution,
Right.
and the sitting president of the United States calls that congressman a loser,
Right.
in public, and proclaims, I'm going to use AIPAC and I'm going to use everything I can to get you out of office.
Yeah.
That isn't, you shouldn't support that kind of behavior.
Why does he? Okay, look, most people in Congress supported him. 90% of of the people, 95% of the
Right.
people on the Republican side support. I think Massey's the only one in the Republican. So forget the Democrats. Okay, we know the Democrats are going to oppose him just because.
Right.
Okay,
Just because.
we know that. We got that. He's one guy. Massey's one guy. He disagrees with you. He called you out. Okay, but he's one guy. So I don't understand why he feels so threatened by Massey. And I don't agree with everything about Massey, but I'll tell you what, on this issue of him, if nothing else, for the spine that Massey has shown, you got to say, and it's going to piss some people off, but you got to say, Massey's a great American, just for the spine that he has shown, whether you agree with him or not.
No question about it. I mean, we've entered in a different world. I mean, and take this as you like. There are going to be people who roll their eyes, and take it as you like. But could you have seen, if George Washington lived in an era where there were, instant communications and iPhones and all that, do you think George Washington would have said the F word to the press?
No.
There's no way. There's no way. I doubt he said it in private. Do you know why? Could you imagine Madison
No.
or Jefferson? No. Do you know why? Because they knew one thing above all other things. There is no liberty without virtue. Period. You cannot expect to be unvirtuous and to be free. Those two things will never coexist. And so we live at a time where a president calls a congressman a loser in public, where he says the F word in public. And then why did he get mad at one guy? Because that one guy was the one guy with any sort of bully pulpit that could call him out on his stuff.
Right.
And frankly, he's called him out correctly. And we have to pick.
Yeah.
Define patriotism. Because if you're going to hitch your wagon to Donald Trump and say, that's patriotism to me, you might be in for a bumpy ride.
Yep.
But if you hitch your wagon to the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, then you'll always be going in the right way.
Yeah.
Even though you may be alone in that wagon sometimes.
Yeah.
At least you know you're going the right way.
And I would think
The American way.
Yeah, I would think the admission, and this is something that Speaker Johnson said. Well, we've taken action 125 times. I'm thinking you should not be proud of that. That 125 times since 1945 that presidents have taken action without Congress. Okay, to me that's Okay, that should be a lesson learned. Okay, there's something wrong here. This is out of whack. And I got it, nuclear weapons. But you know what? We've been dealing with, and here's what I'll say: if why don't we just make it national policy? Let's just have the debate. And look, I despise the Islamic government of Iran. I have no illusions about Islam. Okay, Islam is a dangerous doctrine. It's a doctrine from hell, incompatible with the Constitution. Okay, bottom line, that's my opinion. You'll never change it. So why don't we have the national debate and say, okay, it is now national policy. Let's vote on it that if Iran gets to this close to achieving, let's lay out the parameters of achieving, of creating a nuclear weapon. Well, then the president has no choice but to take action.
Well, we have a way to do that, Dave. But the problem is, all of this requires congressmen to actually go on the record, and they don't want that. They want to be able to say, if it all goes well, I supported the president's action, blah, blah, blah. And if it goes to hell, they want to be able to say, I guess we should, if we'd have just stuck to the Constitution. So we have a way.
Right.
Let's have an amendment. Let Congress propose an amendment granting to the president power, the war powers as defined in the War Powers Act. They don't do that because they know that such a thing would require them to actually take a stand. And they don't want to take a stand because taking a stand might cost them votes, and all they care about is power. And it reminds me of what Madison said to Jefferson. The last person that you want to give power to is someone willing to ask you for it.
That's true.
I mean, who do you want to? You want to give power to a person you think, you know what, that guy's got a good head on his shoulders. I like his wisdom. I like his opinion. Let's vote for him. Not a guy who's going to sit there and do whatever it takes to get reelected, to sit there in those marble palaces. And I'll say there's only ever been one country that's dropped a nuke on another country.
Yeah, true. I got it.
I mean, you can say that it was good or bad, and that's not part of this discussion, but we're the only ones who's ever done it. Or does that mean what gives us the right to tell others that they can't use it on their enemies?
Yeah. Does that mean that there's no other country that would? I mean, I think
would or could. I mean, what the principle that said we're going to do it, shouldn't another country, an equal sovereign country, have the right to say, well, our enemies are doing this to us. We have this weapon. We're going to use it on them. The point is, this document does not give the federal government the power to tell other sovereign states, meaning sovereign countries, how they can use their weapons and who their enemies are allowed to be and who it's not allowed to be. It doesn't exist. Sure. And we've got to come to that place where we read on July 4th, man, if every one of your listeners and viewers could take those few minutes before when y'all are sitting down, read before you say the prayer on the food, read this Declaration of Independence so that when you say that prayer, you can give thanks for the blood of American martyrs that James Madison spoke of. Just take the time to read it. Feel that. Let the Spirit testify in your heart that these things are true. And then maybe we have a renaissance of a love of liberty in this country, because it's in my opinion that the Spirit will testify to anyone about anything that's true. And these principles are true.
Absolutely.
Right.
Well, that sounds like an excellent closing thought, unless you have anything to add to that.
I can't believe I messed up on the Johns. John Taylor of Caroline.
Okay.
John Calhoun.
Okay.
And John Randolph of Roanoke. I can't believe I left John Randolph off. I was like, I can't believe I did that. Yeah, John Taylor of Caroline, John Calhoun, and John Randolph of Roanoke. If you read the things by those three Johns, you'll understand more about the American government than you will if you got a PhD in American history.
Okay. All right. I guess we've got a couple questions if you have time. And I know we
go on then. Let's see, what time is it? I got a couple minutes.
Okay. All right. So let's see here. Viewer. Okay. Okay. Somebody wants to know who the bust is over your shoulder. I think that's Madison.
That's James Madison.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Is one reason the Articles of Confederation didn't work is because of the commerce between the states. Government couldn't control it. That's a question about Articles of Confederation.
Yes, that is one reason. But you'll look at. It's so funny, these people that call for a so-called convention of states,
Right.
trademark, because that phrase doesn't exist except in the copyright and trademark
Yeah.
office. They mention that, oh, there are these conventions before Philadelphia. Okay, first of all, they weren't conventions.
Right.
I mean, you wouldn't call the Mount Vernon Conference a convention. It was more like getting together at George's house for lunch.
Right.
I mean, you had the Annapolis, which was a little better attended, but none of them had this concept of throwing away the Articles of Confederation and coming up with a new government. But my point is that you can tell by how poorly attended these conferences and these attempts to change the articles were. You can tell that the people in general, and Patrick Henry at the very beginning of the Virginia ratifying convention in that summer of 89, he says, you claim that everybody's saying the Articles of Confederation don't work and are not functioning. Where are these people? Because I don't see them saying that. I don't hear that, right? So that's one of those things. Yes, there were states that the commerce, they were having issues, but they could have been worked out. But it's also a thing where there were people saying, well, we can be more united and have less of these fights. Is that true? Probably. But I mean, how many disagreements are you willing to put up with in exchange for your liberty? I mean, think about you and your neighbor. You know, y'all don't eat dinner at the same time. Your kids don't go to bed at the same time. Y'all don't go to bed at the same time. Y'all don't mow your grass the same day at the same time. But you do all those things.
Right.
Could you be more peaceful if you agreed on all those things? Sure, I guess. Are you willing to trade that for your liberty? No.
No.
Well, but this is what came down to the art toast to answer that person's question. Yes, that's right. That's what happened. But it was magnified way beyond what was necessary. It could have been settled by the Second Continental Congress, by the Second Continental Congress or by the Confederation Congress. It could have been settled without the need for throwing out the entire Constitution and the entire form of government.
Right.
But yes, commerce was the central issue.
Absolutely. Well, hey, thanks for coming on, for being with us and spending so much time, and we really appreciate it. I'd love to have you back. Definitely going to check out your books and just keep up the great work.
Get this by compact, not command, guys. Get this to read it yourself and then read it to your young ones by compact, not command. Let them learn what the government of the United States was meant to be, so that in a few years when they're old enough, they can help us get it back.
Absolutely. I want to thank the audience for taking the time to watch our program tonight. Please be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons as well as the notification bell so you never miss an episode. We appreciate your support. It doesn't cost anything to subscribe, so subscribe and share with your friends. Check out our audio podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, and other platforms as well. Sign up for our weekly newsletter at our website, tninformer.com. Also, please find and follow us on Facebook and X. I do these weekly audios called Dave's Raves. They're little 2-minute commentaries. I try to do a couple a week. This week is kind of iffy, but I will try to at least get one out for you. I did one the other day that should be out by now. Another feature we're going to be doing soon is going to be called the Reptile Files, an update on the dirty deals done to us, the citizens, by legislators and other elected or appointed officials, whether they be state or federal. For instance, the voucher plan passed in Tennessee this past session. The legislature is not going to track the number of students who are already in private schools that will now be receiving vouchers. The fiscal note on the bill estimated that 65% of the funding would go to those already in private schools. Without tracking this aspect of it, there is no way of knowing how many are just receiving a subsidy versus moving from a public school to a private school. and the $70,295 voucher is not thought to be enough to cover most private school costs. So once again, our Republican supermajority is being deceptive, which seems to be their strong suit. The training I attended Saturday, sponsored by the Tennessee Firearms Association with author and conservative activist Brett Rogers, was excellent. I highly recommend his book, The Goal is to Win. I've attended other political training events in the past, and there are other good ones out there, but this one really, really stands out. I encourage you to get the book and sponsor a seminar if you can. Contact Brett Rogers at brett@rightrally.com. If you want to order the book, you can go to thegoalistowin.com. Constitutional Sheriff's Training online every Thursday in July at 7 p.m. Central. Know what your sheriff should know. Sign up at TennesseeConservativeNews.com/events. There will be no show on July 7th, but we'll be back on the 14th to discuss Nathan Bedford Forrest and celebrate his birthday a day late with our special guest, Gene Andrews, who is the caretaker of Nathan's boyhood home. Nathan Bedford Forrest is the general they want you to forget all about for all the wrong reasons. You've heard one side, let's hear the whole story. We'll be challenging modern narratives and defending Forrest's legacy. You don't want to miss that. Then on Thursday, you're not going to want to miss the important episode where I sit down with the one and only Dr. Ken Berry live here in the studio. Ken is the doctor who's been blowing the lid off food and health industries. We're talking protein, politics, medical freedom, and enjoying everything the mainstream does not want you to hear. If you've ever questioned the food pyramid, wondered why Big Pharma wants you sick, or just want to hear the truth from someone who isn't afraid to speak it, this is the episode for you. Tune in and share it. Get ready. It's going to be an awesome episode. Hope you'll join us again next time. That's it for now. Good night from Paris, Tennessee, that is.